I'm absolutely delighted once again to welcome Professor Sanderson back to give his third lecture in this series for this term anyway. I mean, he's done many others on the Tantrāloka last term. And he's carrying on with the opening verses of Abhinavagupta's Tantrāloka. So, Professor Sanderson.
Thank you. Well, last week we read a potentially rather boring verse on his father, but I think it has a lot of interest in it. Although his father was not one of his religious preceptors, he introduced him, as we saw, to the elements of Brahmanical education. And if I'd had more time, I'd have elaborated that theme and shown that he actually produced a number of treatises in the various basic Brahmanical disciplines, which unfortunately have not survived in Vaisheshika and particularly in grammar. Perhaps I mentioned his Prakirnaka commentary, unfortunately lost, on the fantastically difficult Prakirnaka chapter of Bhartrahari's Vakyapadiyya. That unfortunately we don't have. But anyway, it's quite clear that he wasn't just a person who passed his O-levels, as it were, his GCSE. You know, he did advanced study in all these disciplines before he moved on to Shaiva education. And this is something to be borne in mind with the Shaiva tradition of Kashmir. It's post-doctoral, as it were. The texts, both Siddhantika and non-Siddhantika, make it very clear that you must first be thoroughly trained in the sciences of grammar, hermeneutics, and reasoning, and then, it seems to be in the convention, also in kavya. You needed to have an advanced understanding of fine writing, ability to appreciate poetry, and then comes immersion in the Shaiva tradition. So it's a kind of luxury extra in Brahmanical education, rather than a choice early on in the career. You must first be fully trained in the Brahmanical tradition and then be immersed in the Shaiva. And this relationship reflects the Shaiva's view of their relationship to Brahmanical learning and Brahmanical society, that while on one level they challenge notions such as caste, on another the idea is that they must fit in with the institutions of Brahmanical society, while transcending them, as it were, internally, either mentally alone or else in the privacy of sectarian practice, which is not visible to the outside world. So, for example, when it comes to any feast that is held among initiates, they must be arranged in initiatory order, not in the order of caste, whereas in the Siddhantika Shaiva system, caste distinctions are maintained in the rows of diners, so Brahmin row, Kshatriya row, etc. But according to the Śākta-oriented Shaiva traditions, that is a sin. You must not observe birth caste in any social interactions within the community of initiates. So there's a kind of view that the Brahmanical system takes you so far, but not to liberation. But nonetheless, you must act within it as far as the outside world is concerned. You must marry your daughters in caste and so forth. I think there was no attempt to subvert the state-maintained varnashrama vyavastha, clear distinction between varnas and religious disciplines. Nonetheless, it's striking that in the works of Abhinavagupta there's almost no reference to his caste or his traditional Brahmanical identity. A few incidental remarks are made, but it seems to be a literary convention among these non-dualist Shaivas that although they're obviously Brahmins, and there are one or two indications that they don't refer to the fact. They don't go out of their way to say, I am a Brahmin of this Gotra, following this Veda, having performed these Vedic sacrifices, which is the way Brahmins normally identify themselves, or are identified in inscriptions, for example, where land grants are being made. That's what's relevant. Your caste, your Gotra, your 3 pravaras or 5 pravaras, your supposed ancestors and so forth, and your learning and ritual competence in various disciplines. So if you've sponsored a Soma sacrifice, you're going to be called Agnishtoma Yaji. That's part of your identity. It's like a title that you carry. So these Kashmirian Shaivas, on the whole, are not eager to parade their Vedic credentials, shall we say. unlike South Indian Shaiva teachers in the Siddhantika tradition, who very frequently do proclaim the fact that they've performed a soma sacrifice and so forth. There's a much bigger emphasis on not merely not rocking the boat, but actually being thoroughly qualified, not merely in living within caste, but also in performing even Śrauta rituals. So there, being a Shaiva is the most exhausting business, because you've got to satisfy the full requirements of Śrauta Brahmanism and, in addition, take on the obligations of being a Shaiva. And this is a role that is not compatible with normal domestic life, I imagine. This is really restricted to the landed gentry or to priests who have no function other than the performance of religion. But let me get on with my main subject now. We're coming to verse 13, in which finally Abhinavagupta acknowledges his principal teacher in the Kula Prakriya, the Kaula level of the Trika, which is the subject of this treatise that he's beginning. And he says here, Jayata Jagad Udriti Kshamosau Bhagavatya Saha Shambhunata Ekaha Yadudirita Shasanam Shubirme Prakatoyam Gahanopi Shastra Margaha. Jayatad, this is a precative, may he be supreme. I think I pointed out in an earlier lecture that the verb ji, to conquer, the verb ji is regularly mistranslated in these contexts as conquer. It means be supreme, not conquer. It's an intransitive verb in this usage. There are two jis in the dhatu pata. Ji jaye, which is akarmaka, intransitive, with no object, and sakarmaka, ji abhivave, ji to overpower. That's conquer in the normal sense. But if you look at our translations of Kavya or, say, Subhashita collections, where there are many benedictory verses gathered, you will see them regularly mistranslated. You will see this regularly mistranslated as "may he conquer," or Shiva conquers, or Ganesha conquers, and so forth. It means Sarvortarshena vartate. He is supreme, or Sarvotkristo bhavati. It's simply an assertion of supremacy. And if the precative is used, as here, as a prayer, may he be supreme, then it applies, of course, to gurus easily enough. May this guru be supreme, may he be recognized as the ultimate authority. When replied to deities, you may say, well, how can you pray that a deity will be supreme? Surely the deity is automatically supreme. The idea would then be, may he be recognized as supreme by all. May he be sovereign in the sense, may all recognize his supremacy. And we see glosses on those lines. So I pray that Shambhunata, in the second pada, Shambhunata Ekaha, my unprecedented, unequaled guru. Eka, unequaled. Asau, it means that. Obviously, it doesn't just mean that. It means that exceptional one. Asau is often used in the sense of apurva or alaukika, out of lokotara, for example. Various glosses are used. The same thing applies to kashchit. This is also used frequently by these authors in the devotional context to mean exceptional, apurva, unprecedented. So I pray that Shambhunata, Asau Eka Shambhunata, my unprecedented, unequal guru, I pray that he may reign supreme, Jayatat, Bhagavatya Saha, together with Bhagavati. Bhagavati is the name of his consort. And the term for this consort, this is not Mrs. Shambhunata, this is a strange category which we don't fully understand, of a tantric consort known to the Kaulas under the unsurprising term duti, or female messenger or go-between. In Kavya, a duti is a woman who acts as a go-between between two lovers, or trying to arrange a rendezvous between two would-be lovers. So for some reason, the tantric consort has been given this title, duty, sometimes with long I, sometimes with short I. Perhaps the idea is, I've never seen this explained in any text, that she acts as a kind of intermediary between the practitioner and the goddess. She's like the intermediary, the carrier of the message from one to the other. So this is unexpected. Generally speaking, gurus are venerated in their own right, independently of any other relationship they may have. But this is the special case because this is the Kaula Guru. So he's venerating Shambhunatha together with Bhagavati. Yadudirita shasanam shubir me prakatoyam kahanopi shastra margaha. Literally, through the rays of the teaching, shasana teaching, amshu ray, through the rays of the teaching, the sunbeams of the teaching, uttered by whom, Yadudirita, by whom, i.e. by Shambhunatha, ayam shastra margaha, this path of scripture, i.e. the Śaiva canon, with its Kaula focus in this case, this path of Shastra, Gahanopi, though impenetrably deep, although almost impossible to plumb the depths of, it's so profound, so difficult and so forth. Gahanopi, although so profound, has been made prakata, manifest or clear. So he's praying to Shambhunatha, praying for the jaya, the supremacy of this guru and his consort, who together with her has revealed to him, clarified this otherwise obscure and profound teaching in the Kaula revelation, or in the Śaiva revelation culminating in the Kaula revelation. Yeah. So I've translated that a little freely in the note that you in the handout that you have. I pray that Shambhunatha, my unprecedented, unequaled guru, may reign supreme with his consort Bhagavati, for it is he, possessing as he does the power to liberate all beings, Jagat Udrati Kshamaha, being able to lift up, rescue all beings, Jagat, possessing as he does the power to liberate all beings, that has fully illuminated with the light beams of his teaching this path to liberation, taught in Shiva's scriptures, hard to penetrate though it is. Now, I'll spend the rest of the lecture commenting on this verse and various things that arise from it. Now, the first thing there you see under the heading, no kula prakriya without a duty. Those without duties may leave. They've been given a trigger warning. If there is anyone who's going to be triggered by this, they should leave at this point, although I'm not going to go into any details. This is being recorded, after all, and this is a Rahasya Shastra. So the first point I want to make is a citation there from Jayarata's commentary on Tantrāloka. Kula prakriyayam hi duti mantarena kvachidapi karmani nadikara iti. Atas tatsahabhava upanibandha. Tatsahabhav upanibandha. He, expressing reason for, he's saying, why has he said this? Why does he mention Bhagavati? The reason is, Kula prakriyayam duti mantarena kvachidapi karmani nadikara. Na adhikara, nasti adhikara. There is no qualification in any ritual. Kvachid api karmani, kasminchid api karmani. In the Kula system, Kula prakriyam, dutim antarena, without the duty. He's making it quite clear. Forget proceeding in the Kaula path without a duty. Atas tatsahabhava upanibandha. Therefore, there is the upanibandha, the mention of his being accompanied by her, tatsahabhava, his being with, sahabhava, her, tat. Yeah. Now, the next citation you have, number 2, comes from the Tantrāloka Viveka on the 29th chapter, which is the chapter devoted to the specifics of the Kula Prakriya. And there, the question of the necessity, A, of external ritual, and B, of a duty, of doing that external ritual with the assistance of a duty of a female consort, is taken up. And this, of course, is a crucial issue, and you can imagine it's one that was quite controversial. Almost inevitably, there are going to be those who say, yes, it can be done externally, but ultimately it's the internal process that matters, so you can forget about the external duty. There would obviously be a tendency to split in this way between those who insisted on external practice with the duty, in spite of its socially challenging nature, and those who said, no, it's not necessary. We have a similar bifurcation going on in esoteric Buddhism between acharyas in the Yogini Tantras who say, no, there must be the sexual element in the ritual, and those who say, yes, there must, unless the religion is not well enough established in that reason for the law to turn a blind eye. If this is going to bring the religion into disrepute, then don't do it. And then there are those who say, never do it. It's just internal. So in the initiation, the guru shows you a card with a picture of a duty on it, rather than giving you the duty in the ritual. We could go into the details, but no need to. I just want to point out that the requirement that the practice occur with a female consort, who is not your wife, by the way, is obviously a socially highly challenging one. And one would expect there to be divergent views. My own experience in Kashmir was that it was something that the ancestors did, or your guru's guru. No one actually said, yes, yeah, that's quite right. And by the way, John or Lakshman Narayan, you're now at the stage in which you can practice like that. Who would you like to practice with? This didn't arise as far as I can see. It was an ideal thing which was projected back into the past, at least in the 20th century that I experienced. No doubt there are other communities where external practice was still vital, but not, I think, in Kashmir at that time. So that is an indication of how the Gnostic trend has taken over from the ritual and subordinated it, recognized it, that my teacher in Kashmir didn't deny these sexual practices, but he didn't insist on them. It was not something that was said, oh, you must prepare for this is what you're aiming at. I think that had been largely bypassed in practice. So this is the passage I want to look at now. Bahya charya vihinasya dushparapa kauliko vidi. The kaula way, the kaula practice, kauliko vidihi, is virtually impossible to achieve. Dushparapa, literally difficult to be achieved. But duh here means ashakyapraya, virtually impossible, come impossible. Very often duh followed by such a form means actually impossible to accomplish. Not actually difficult, but simply impossible. So the kaula procedure is virtually impossible to accomplish. Bahya charya vihinasya, for a person who is devoid of vihinasya, who lacks bahya charya, external observance, external practice. Don't think you can just internalize it all and achieve the same goal. There has to be this external practice as well, according to this source. Ityādyuktya bāhyacharya tāvad avashya bhavyam. By the principle, by the statement, by such statements, ityādyuktya, as that I've just translated, we have to understand that external practice is most certainly, as we can all agree on the basis of such texts, unavoidable, avashya bhavya. It has to be undertaken. It's compulsory. It's not an option. Tatrapicha dutim antarena na kachit da sampati. And there is no accomplishing of that, no perfecting of that ritual, external ritual. In that case also, in that external practice, there's no, in that external practice, tatrapi, even in that, or in that also, there can be no perfection, no success, sampati, without the duty. So, in practice, I should add here, on the basis of Tantrāloka 29, you don't have to practice with the duty every time you worship. It's only necessary to do it on certain occasions. You can do it every time if you can, but he's not prohibiting that, but there's no absolute requirement. So there are also other ways of doing the Shakti Puja, the worship of the goddess embodied in the female, mentally, in the breath and various other ways, but on Parva days, the female must be there. You can't avoid it altogether and still call yourself a Kaula. So, Ityaha Bhahyastaya Shaktya Sakabiti. That is why Abhinavagupta has said in the verse on which this commentator is commenting, with a consort, a Shakti, who is Bhahyastaya, with an external consort. Therefore it has been stated in scripture, taduktam, for that reason, tat means tasmat, therefore it has been stated in scripture, kartavya sarvato dutir, dutihino nasidyati. Therefore you must make a duty. So a woman must be appointed as your duty, as your consort, your duty. Notice here the short I, it can be the dutihi or duti. A person who lacks the duty cannot achieve success, nasidibak. So there's plenty of strong scriptural support for this position. And also, iti tata brahmanasya yata patni yaya saha yajet make. Just as for a Brahmin, brahmanasya, there must be a wife, patni, with whom he can worship in Vedic sacrifice. Evam duti kulacharye geya nityodite kule. So in the eternally active kula, this is just a conventional epithet, so in this ever active supreme kula, nityodite kule, know that there is likewise evam a duty for the kulacharya. The master of the kula teacher, the kula guru, must have a duty. Otherwise he has no adhikara. So I don't need to translate it again, but you can read my more considered translation in your own time. Now, what kind of connection is it with the duty? I wish we had some sociological evidence, or more sociological evidence, about the nature of this relationship. But apparently you can't just dump her on a whim. You don't sort of find a female and then dump her. The next passage indicates that this is a permanent, at least long-term commitment, and to abandon her, to move off to another, requires a penance. Frankly, the penance is not that exacting. So I don't think it would be entirely impossible to change duties. We'll see. Dutim chaktva nachan yatragachet kama vimohita. That could be interpreted too. He should not go elsewhere, and the root to gum, gum, is often used in a sexual sense. He should not have congress elsewhere, abandoning the duty, dutim tyaktva, deluded by lust, kama vimohita. Now I said that could also be interpreted, no. He can do it if he's not deluded by lust. A commentator might argue like that, no? I think probably that's not intended. The idea is that you shouldn't let your lust get the better of you and you wander off to another attractive female you think would make a better duty. Once you've made your commitment, you stick to her. I think that's all the text is saying. But one can see that some determined exegete who wished a greater degree of freedom in his personal relations might decide to interpret, say, I'm not driven by lust, I'm driven by the desire for deeper spiritual experience. So it's fine. Yeah. Duti raksha sada karya adikena tu bojayet. This is a rather charming statement. You must guard the duty at all times. Look after her, protect her. and give her more to eat than you give yourself. Adikena to bojet. Feed her up. You should show your respect for her by, caring for her in all respects, including food, and you should feed her more elaborately than you feed yourself. Adikena to bojet. I can't see any other meaning to that. Duti parigrahe nyatra gataschet kama mohita laksha japam tata kuryat ityuktam brahmayamale. It has been said in the Brahmayamala that if chet, deluded by lust, kama mohita, he goes to another, anyatra gataha, when he has already formally adopted a duty parigrahe. Parigraha is the act of choosing a duty, or shishya parigraha is the act of accepting a disciple, bhumi parigraha, the act of taking up a particular plot of land for a ritual or whatever. That's what parigraha means. It means a formal acceptance, a formal adoption. So once he has formally adopted his duty, but goes elsewhere out of lust, deluded by lust, then he should repeat his root mantra 100,000 times. Well, that would take us a while, but actually so many tantric rituals require 100,000 recitations. It's not going to be that exacting. He's not being told to drink molten lead or some of the punishments ordained in Manu for sexual transgression. So if he does it, then he should recite his root mantra 100,000 times. The problem is, once a person has been initiated, they're in a sense immune to extreme penance. The idea is, in fact, formally speaking, if they've been properly initiated, they can't be anything other than liberated at death. Otherwise you're saying the ritual doesn't work. So you have to say that penances are just for appearances. So the outside world says he went off with someone else, but at least he's doing the penance. But from a theoretical point of view, once initiated, you're virtually liberated. You will be liberated at death, if not sooner. So why do you need to do penances? All your karma has been destroyed in the ritual. You're not accumulating new karma because that's been blocked as well by the ritual. So it's just for the sake of appearances. Loka rakshartam, in order to preserve the appearance of propriety in the world. Yeah. Now, why is the duty considered so important, so indispensable? And the next passage gives us some indication of this, some guidance on this. This is also from the Tantrāloka of Viveka, this time on the same verse, 1.13, an unattributed quotation. Yukta samvatsarad siddhir iha pumsam bayatmanam sa siddhis tatvanishtanam strinam dvadashabi dinai. It's one of the few positive statements indicating the spiritual superiority of women over men that you'd expect in this tradition. It says that siddhi, that success, ya siddhi, which comes about for men, pumsam, after a whole year, samvatsarat, so what a man can achieve in a whole year, that can be achieved by women, sa siddhi strinam, in 12 days. Dvadashabi dinai. They can achieve in 12 days what a man can only achieve after a year. And the two adjectives there indicate why. Men being bayatmanam, timid. What does he mean by timidity here? He's referring to assuming that men are deeply indoctrinated by Brahmanical inhibition. And so they hold back. They can't immerse themselves in the joy of the senses, the joy of consciousness. They're held back by inhibitions. I'm a Brahmin, I can't do that. This is not a Vedic mantra. All these inhibitions plague men's minds, according to this understanding. Whereas women are, you could take this as an implication that women are not highly educated, you could say. They haven't been indoctrinated in the same way. Women are naturally established in reality, tatvanishtanam. So on the one hand, you have Tatvanishtanam Strinam, women who are established in reality, grounded in reality, and men who are timid, terrified, inhibited, Bhayatmanam. Atma here means Tatpara. They are immersed in Bhaya, in fear. Idam Sprishyam Nava. Can I touch this or not touch it? What is his caste? What is her caste? Is this drink permitted or not? Men are plagued by endless Shanka, dictated by Brahmanical injunction. And women, I'm not sure this is true, but the implication is that Indian women in the system, especially low caste women, are not so indoctrinated. And therefore they are an avenue to reality, which can enable the garlic-fearing Brahmin to come into contact with reality and to transcend his barriers of fear and inhibition. Yes. So the passage goes on. Ata surupam subagam sarupam bhavitashayam adaya yoshitam kuryad archanam japanam hutam. Therefore, for this reason, he should perform his archanam, his puja, his japanam, his recitation, repetition of his root mantra, and hutam, his fire offerings to that mantra and its ancillaries, i.e. the whole range of his regular rituals, having taken Adaya, a woman, Adaya Yoshitam, who is Surupam, beautiful, and some of the texts go to great lengths describing this beauty in completely conventional terms, taken straight from Kavya, the usual ideas. A beautiful woman who is, I'm afraid we have what look like a repetition of synonyms, Surupam, Subagam, almost as if we were in a Buddhist text, which in Buddhist texts, as you know, pile up synonyms quite redundantly. A beautiful consort who is Subagam, perhaps that means charming rather than simply beautiful to look at, but charming. A woman who is Sarupam, of like nature to oneself. She must be open to this experience. One whose awareness is free of contamination by mundane notions. Bhavitashaya, one whose mind is bhavita, purified, pure, which means in this context, free of the impurity of mundane vikalpas, which inhibit the play of the senses, the immersion, the aesthetic appreciation of what's around you. From Abhinavagupta's point of view, the state of bondage is one of starvation of the senses. The senses are being deprived of their due. The senses are goddesses which need satisfaction. If satisfy the senses, they will stimulate consciousness and lead to revelation. This is his basic idea. We as Brahmins, I speak from his point of view, are in a state of bondage because we are inhibited by Brahmanical injunction. Let go of that, and enlightenment rests in the palm of your hand. It seems to be the view. Now, the next point I want to take up is evidence of this Kaula Trika outside Kashmir, in the Deccan, in fact. And the reason why this comes up is because Shambhunatha's lineage goes back into the Deccan. This is what I want to show now. It's not a Kashmiri lineage. This has come to Kashmir from the Deccan via Jalandhara, which is not the modern city of Jalandhar, but the Pita, which is up in the hills, Kangra. So forget any associations with Jalandhar that you may have. Jalandhara Pita here is up in the mountains, Kangra, Jalandhara Pita. So this is a verse, again an unattributed quotation, which is given in the Tantrāloka Viveka. Kaschid dakshina bhumi pita vasati Shriman Vibhur Bhairava Pancha Srotasi Sati Marga Vibhave Shastre Vidata Chaya Loke Bhut Sumatis Tata Samudabhut Tasyaiva Shishya Agrani Shriman Shambhur Iti Prasiddhi Magamat Jalandharat pitataha. And there arose among mankind an extraordinary, illustrious and all-powerful Bhairava. A Bhairava here means a human being who is, as it were, Bhairava by virtue of enlightenment. Dwelling in the Dakshina Bhumi Pita, the Pita of the Dakshina Bhumi, the Pita of the south, the Deccan. Dakshina Bhumi here is the same as Dakshinapata, a rather non-specific reference to the Deccan. So dwelling in the sacred site, the Pita, that is the seat of the goddess in the Deccan. Dakshina Bhumi Pita, Pita is the seat of a goddess. An authoritative author, Vidhata, on the scriptures, Shastre, comprising the 5 streams, Panchasrotasi Shastre, that's the Tantra Marga, or Mantra Marga rather, the Mantra Marga, the system of the 5 streams, the Siddhanta, the Dakshina, the Vama, the Bhautika and the Garudika, the 5 elements of the conventional enumeration of the Mantra Marga. Sati Marga Vibhave, together with the glory, Vibhava, of the Ati Marga. Now the Ati Marga here does not mean the Parshapata and related traditions. That's another and common meaning of Ati Marga, the original meaning. But it was, because it became associated with the Kapalika tradition as well, Ati Marga, it was then transferred to the Kaula tradition. So Ati Marga in this context means the Kula Shastra, not the pre-Tantric Ati Marga. So he's saying he was an authoritative author on the scriptures of the 5 streams, together with the majestic Ati Marga. He was succeeded by Sumati, that same Guru's illustrious chief disciple, Shambhunatha by name, achieved exceptional spiritual attainment, Prasiddhim Agamat, from the Pita Jalandhara, from the sacred site of the goddess in Kangra. Now, evidence of the Trika in the Deccan then, the Kaula Trika. The first evidence I've mentioned elsewhere in my publications, and that is that we have clear evidence in the scriptures of the Paschimamnaya, the cult of Kubjika, that the basic texts of that tradition were composed in the Deccan and in the Konkan coastal strip. And these texts, the Kubjika Mata, the Kudalikamnaya and related works, the Mantana Bhairava, etc., are deeply dependent upon the scriptures of the Trika. You could say, if I may be allowed to caricature roughly, the Kubjika corpus is the Trika plus. They've taken materials from the Trika scriptures and added in the cult of Kubjika. It's very closely related to the Trika, and in fact the Paschimamnaya says that the Trika Kaula, the Kaula tradition of the Trika, which it calls Purvamnaya, is the mirror image of the Paschimamnaya and arose from it. Historically speaking, it's the other way around. The Paschimamnaya arose from the Purvamnaya, but naturally they're not going to allow themselves to be considered secondary. So they invert the relationship. So that's the first evidence. But what about textual references? Well, you'll see that in number 7, I've given a passage, or 2 passages, 7 and 8, from the Yashastilaka, which is a wonderful prose poem by Somadeva Suri, a very learned Jaina scholar and poet, working in Andhra in the 10th century. And there are 2 passages in this extraordinary work which refer to the Trika. And here's the first one. Tasya sakala jana sadharanepi swadehe trikamata dikshitasyeva deva bhuyena abhinivishamanasya katichit samvatsara vyatichakramu. I've shortened the citation so you can see what the main part is. It's a narrative. He's talking about a certain wicked prince called Maridatta, who's coming to no good. He'll get his comeuppance in due course. One of the problems is that he has delusions about himself which make him resemble an initiate in the Trika. So this is what the text says. Several years passed for this wicked prince Maridatta, who lived like an initiate in the Trika fully believing in his own body as a god, although it was no different from anybody else's. It's a very giant remark. And then the next one is even more explicit. Kula charyaka sarveshu peya peya bhakshya bhakshyadishu nishanka chitad vritaditi kula charyaka. The kula charyakas, the function of that suffix kan is that these are considered vile. The vile kulacharyas, kulacharyaka. And of course this is a giant assessment of the karmas. Of course those vile kulacharyas maintain that one is liberated. That has to be supplied from the context of a couple of pages back. It's a very long prose poem. The vile kulacharyas maintain that one is liberated by practice, vritat, in which the mind is free of inhibition, nishanka chitad, it's a bahuvarihi, in which the mind is free of inhibition, nishanka, in such matters as the distinction between permitted and forbidden foods and drinks. Peya peya bhaksha bhakshyadishu, nishanka chitad vritat. For the Trika doctrine teaches that one should propitiate Sharvan Ishvara, Ardhanara Ishvara, Sharvan Ishvara at night, with one's mouth fragrant with wine, with one's heart tranquil from the taste of meat, adopting the Shakti seal, that's a special mudra posture, and yoga posture, with one's consort positioned beside one to the left, assuming in this way the likeness of Shiva in his Uma Maheshwara form. Uma Maheshwara is Shiva with the Devi seated on his left thigh. In Eastern India, a rather charming detail not seen elsewhere is that he has his hand to her chin, sort of affectionately touching her chin. You don't see that outside Bengal and Magadha generally. So we're referring here to a loving couple worshipping at night with the consumption of wine and meat, and this way we get the three makaras, the three M's. The early tradition has three M's, not five. Later on the Shaktas added two more, as if they desperately wanted to fill the number up to five. What else begins with M? Fish, matsya. Can you think of anything else? Well, not really. How about mudra? But mudra is not a substance. Well, we're going to call parched grain mudra from now on. So it's clear this rather artificial attempt to make up the number. The early sources speak of three M's, and they are maitunam, sexual intercourse, madhyam, intoxicating liquor, and mangsa, meat. Now, someone who has studied the Trika from the Tantrāloka, the Siddhyogeswari Mata, the Malini Vijayotara, the main available text in this tradition, will say, he's got it wrong. Somadeva Suri has got it wrong. The Trika does not venerate Ardhanara Ishvara, because the text, this Sharvan Ishvara, which is there in your text, is a periphrasis, or rather a synonym of Ardhanara Ishvara, that form of Shiva in which he's taken the goddess into himself to form the left half of his body. So they're divided down the central axis. Female on the left, male on the right. So he's claiming that the Trikas worship this form of Shiva. And you can immediately raise an objection. No reference to that in Tantrāloka or in Malini Vijayotara. So he's obviously not really very well informed. Now, I think one thing you can always assume with the Indian Kavya authors, they get their facts right. It's considered a terrible blemish to get your facts wrong. Of course, there are certain cultural errors, such as the belief in king bees as opposed to queen bees. You know, there are cultural mistakes. But errors of fact, of generally accepted fact, are not acceptable, and poets usually go to great lengths to avoid them. So you don't talk about people worshipping Ardhanara Ishvara unless you have evidence that they do. And that is the case. And in the next passages, under the heading The Cult of Ardhanara Ishvara, in the Trika's Tantra Sadbhava, you see this evidence. The Tantra Sadbhava survives in two early palm leaf manuscripts in the Kathmandu Valley and a couple of epigraphs of those manuscripts. Very well preserved text, in fact. And this work is one of the major contributors to the Paschimamnaya corpus, incidentally. So it was very big in the Deccan as well, evidently. And these passages set out the worship of Ardhanarishvara in the Trika. Or rather, they set out the worship of Trika deities visualized in Ardhanarishvara form. In this case, the two alphabet deities, male and female, forming a fused body. And to save time, I'm not going to read through those passages. You can do that in your own time. I've edited them for you and translated them, I hope accurately. And what you see from that is that this is a central concept in the Tantrasadbhava tradition of the Trika. And that tradition I've shown to be very much a major contributor to the Paschimamnaya literature which was developing in the Deccan in the wake of this Trika tradition. So it looks as though Somadeva Suri is basing his evidence upon this tradition which we see in the Tantrasadbhava, not the Malini Vijyottara or the Trisha or Bhairava or other Trika sources, which leads me to just point out to you that the Trika is not monolithic. There are a number of texts which are related to each other, which later tradition defines as Trika scriptures. They don't necessarily use the term Trika, but they worship the same goddesses or very closely related cluster of goddesses, and so later on a corpus is defined, and the Tantrasadbhava is part of that corpus. But clearly by the 10th century already, Somadeva, the learned Jaina scholar Somadeva, knows that this is a form of the Trika, because he uses the term Trika Matam, the doctrine of the Trika. And this is mid-10th century, at a time before the Trika traditions seen in Abhinavagupta and his contemporaries had time to come down to the south. So this is clearly an independent witness. It's not derived from 10th century Kashmir. That's very unlikely, I think. There's no reason to assume that. So I won't go through all these passages because we're already up to 450. But maybe I can just give you a taste. Let's see. Yeah, you might enjoy reading them because they show you something of Karpalika-style tantric worship and something of the visualization of these deities who are quite ferocious. So in this case, next I shall teach you the worship following the Ekavira procedure of the Vidya Parapara, who resides in the left half of the body of Bhairava. One should install and worship the excellent goddess who has 40 syllables on the seed pod at the center of a lotus diagram. Then, my beloved, one should worship Agori and the other 7 yoginis on the 8 petals of that diagram in accordance with the 8 units of this Vidya. She is to be visualized laughing, intoxicated by alcoholic liquor, her eyes rolling with drunkenness, frightening with her long fangs, with her mouth open wide, most terrifying, adorned with a garland of corpses, with vipers, scorpions, and snakes as her jewelry, with her ears adorned with charming lotuses in the form of the hands of human corpses. As loud as the thundering storm clouds at the eon's end, 8-armed, truly fearsome, 3-eyed, with large fangs, seeming to spew forth fire, assuming any form at will, destroying the suffering of her devotees. There's a taste of Śākta visualization of the earlier type, the wilder, more furious Karpalika type, rather than the nice sweetened version of Tripura Sundari that takes over later. You look pleased.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. Yes. So now, moving on to page 10 of your handout. What about Jalandhara? You remember that verse we began with? We were told that the tradition had come from Shambhunatha, had come to Shambhunatha through an unnamed guru in the Deccan who initiated Sumati, who initiated Shambhunatha. And Shambhunatha is said to have achieved exceptional spiritual success as a result of the favour of the Jalandhara Pita, which is almost a deity in itself because it's a divine presence. The Pita of the goddess is the presence of the goddess. So I want to now consider a couple of passages that shed light on this. I think they shed light on it. The first is 15 on your handout. Tishudicham rudrakonad vayavyantam ganeshwaram vatukam trin gurun siddhan yogini pitam archayet. This is in the 29th book of Tantrāloka, and Abhinavagupta is setting out the procedure for the basic puja of the kula. Starting from the northeast corner, Rudra Konat, and descending to the northwestern, Vayavyantam, he should worship the following along the northern side of the mandala. That means on the left of the worshipper. Ganesha, Vatuka, the three gurus, the siddhas, the yoginis, and the pita. The pita, we want to know which pita. It's not good enough just to say the pita. You can't say Om Namah Pitaya, that won't do. It has to be specific. So our commentator does step up and tell us the following, rather interestingly. Pitamiti Jalandharam Yatas tat siddha yogini kramena asya darshanasya avatara. The pita, i.e. the pita to be worshipped here, that Abhinavagupta has mentioned, is Jalandhara, because it was through its siddhas and yoginis that this system came down to us. This darshana, this system, came down to us. We're used to the word darshana in the sense of a philosophical system. That's only one aspect of its use. Any religious system can be a darshana. Two variants of the same ritual system can be called two separate darshanas. It's not restricted to metaphysics or anything like that. And that's an example of it. So the pita to be worshipped here is Jalandhara, because it was through the siddhas and yoginis of Jalandhara that this system has reached us. Now I correlate that with a statement about Shambhunatha's connection with Jalandhara. Now, there is a passage in a work called the Nishisamchara, which is Trika related, which tells us that the deities of Jalandhara, the Jalandhara Pita, are Vameshwara and Vamadevi. And Vamadevi I take to be Vameshwari. It's simply metrically convenient to have Vamadevi there. So in Jalandhara, the god is present, namely Vameshwara Maheshwara, the Shiva called Vameshwara, together united with his consort Vamadevi. Now the next passage, number 18, is from an inscription which unfortunately has been completely destroyed in an earthquake. There was a grotesquely violent earthquake in Kangra in the, when was it? I've forgotten the date now. But anyway, enough to have completely obliterated the inscription. No trace of it was left. The entire temple of Vajreshwari, the goddess Vajreshwari, was reduced to virtually powder. There was a huge loss of life. It was a very major Himalayan earthquake. So no possibility to go back and re-examine the inscription. Now it was edited by Bula, a very competent Sanskritist, at a time when epigraphers still published translations into English of Sanskrit inscription. They didn't just publish the inscription without understanding it, which is now the norm, I think, in Indian epigraphical study, or is looking as though it's becoming the norm. Epigraphists are absolving themselves of the need to provide a translation. Translating these things is absolutely indispensable. It's the only way you can test your understanding of it. It's often only when you do translate it that you see, you don't fully understand it. That's my experience anyway. You can speed read and think you understand, but when you get down to translating, you think, that doesn't quite work. Right, there's something missing here. That's how you get into the heart of a text. So now there is this inscription from Kangra, which was found over the door of the entry into the Jwalamukhi temple, which is a major pilgrimage center in that part of the world. It's published in Epigraphia Indica. You've got the reference there. And I have amended it because it makes absolutely no sense as edited by Bula. You'll see in the third line there, in the smaller typeface, my apparatus for this line. And I am reading Dadyat Adhyana Vadyam Diyamiyam Udayastemni Vajreshwariva. And Buddha's edition has meaninglessly Vidya Vadyana Vadyam, which makes no sense at all. There's no verb, it's hopeless. So I've amended that to Dadyad Adya Anavadyam Diyam Iyam Udayastemni Vajreshwariva. Now Vajreshwari is the goddess of that temple, principal goddess of that temple, Vajreshwari. So the verse means, I pray that this, i.e. this goddess Vajreshwari, may bestow on you today faultless understanding, and thereby Udayasteman, lasting success. This is a part of a prashasti composed by a certain Vedantic Acharya who happened to visit Jwalamukhi, I think in the 17th century. And in the opening verses of this extremely difficult prashasti, it's a real tour de force, which the early editor said, oh, it's just devotional, we won't bother to translate it, it has no historical interest. It's actually a real conundrum in which the poet is doing some very complicated yamaka tricks. If you look at it, you can see dadya, dadyana, vadyam, sound echoes going on there. And in the opening verses, he adores the goddess under different names. Vajreshwari, Jwalamukhi, and Vama. And we see that in the third, in number 19, in the third pada of the fourth verse of this prashasti. Vama Vama Vatadvo Yati Niyati Niriksha Samaksha Samaksha. You see the yamaka going on there. I pray, this is Avatat, that the gracious Avama, goddess Vama, that the gracious Vama may protect you, Avatadvo, Avatadvaha. She who, being asamaksha, beyond the range of our senses, is samaksha, is perceptible, understand only, perceptible only, through the discipline niyati, for niyama, and insight, niriksha, of the ascetic, yati. Now, from this, my analysis of this prashasti, it's clear that, to me, that three goddesses are being addressed in this opening and in this temple by this visiting Brahmin. He is aware of three identities in the same temple. Vajreshwari, which we know from other liturgical materials surviving connected with Kangra, is the principal deity. Jwalamukhi, who used to be present in the temple but is now relocated about 20 miles away in the hills, a very important site for the night yogis, by the way. And this third goddess we don't know from any other source, Vama. She doesn't appear in the later pilgrimage literature, but does appear in this inscription. So it seems that our author had some access, presumably to devotional materials in this pilgrimage site which he visited, and as a distinguished Brahmin, presumably had access to these materials, stayed there for some time to propitiate the goddess, and learnt about this Vama identity. Now, we heard the Nishi Sanchara, it's very early tantric text, telling us that the goddess in Jalandhara is Vamadevi. And of course that's synonymous with Vama or Vameshwari. Those are interchangeable names. Now in Tantrāloka, in the fourth chapter, you can see there, Tantrāloka 4, 178, item 20, we have Vameshwariti Shabdena Prokta Shi Nishi Sanchare. In the Nishi Sanchara is a metrical variant for the sake of the meter. In the Nishi Sanchara, she, and this means the high goddess of the Trika, we can tell that from the context, Matrisadbhava alias Kala Sankarshini, has been called Vameshwari. In other words, he's saying the goddess known as Vameshwari in the Nishi Sanchara is the Kala Sankarshini stroke Matrisadbhava that we've been talking about in the Tantrāloka. Then Jairata steps up and cites the relevant verse from the Nishi Sanchara, which I'm afraid is not found in our fragmentary one manuscript of the Nishi Sanchara from Nepal, but it reads as follows. He quotes it to illustrate what Abhinavagupta is saying, to support what Abhinavagupta is saying. Esha tu kaulaki vidya sarva siddhi pradayika sakasha deva devasya niryata shakti vartmani vameshwar yavatare tu prakashatvam upagata. This Kaula Vidya, this Kaula spell, this Kaula mantra, which bestows all attainments, Sarva Siddhi Pradayika, came forth, Niryata, from the God of gods into the domain of his power, Shakti Vartmani, and then became manifest, i.e. in the world, in her descent, Avatare, as the goddess Vameshwari. Vameshwari Avatare. I think this makes it fairly clear, if not certain, but certainly quite plausible, that we're looking at a cult of Vameshwari in the Pita of Jalandhara, which, for these people at least, was seen not merely as the cult of a local goddess, but as the cult of the supreme goddess manifest in a particular place by virtue of this Kaula connection with this particular sampradaya of siddhas and yoginis, which Shambhunatha had tapped into by achieving his siddhi in that place. Now, somehow he got from there to Kashmir. K.C. Pandey claimed that Abhinavagupta had gone over to Jalandhara for this purpose. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, that he ever stirred from his ancestral home. None, well, we know he stirred from his ancestral home, okay, but never from Kashmir. This is pure fantasy on K.C. Pandey's part. If you look at his biography of Abhinavagupta in his Abhinavagupta historical and philosophical study, you'll see that the biographical material is largely fantastic. He's made it up. It's not supported by any evidence in the text that I've seen, and I think I've seen all that he's seen and some more. There's no evidence at all to support his view. His idea was poetically expressed. Abhinavagupta, having exhausted the wells of learning in Kashmir, was not satisfied, and so wandered beyond Kashmir around the world in search of deeper knowledge. There's nothing to support that scenario that I can see. Anyway, would you leave Kashmir for Kangra, for higher learning? I don't think so, not at this period. Kashmir was one of the great centres of learning at that time. Kangra then, as now, is not a major intellectual centre, shall we say. It was, however, extremely wealthy. It had some very powerful temples, very wealthy temples, and they attracted the attention of Mahmud of Ghazni, who was raiding India and emptying treasuries just at this time, when Abhinavagupta was active, right on the cusp of the 10th and 11th centuries into the early years of the 11th century. And he raided Kangra, and is said, according to the Muslim historians of the period, no doubt exaggerating wildly, to have gone off with countless elephants, slaves, gold, silver, jewellery, and so forth, from the wealthy temples of Kangra. So this was not a good time to be in Kangra. In fact, North India at this time was highly disturbed because of these regular annual raids by Mahmud of Ghazni, of Ghazna, rather, I should say. Ghazna being the region, Ghazni being the capital. And I think it's very plausible that Shambhunatha moved from Jalandhara to Kashmir under pressure of these events. He was known to be a great sadhaka, and insiders in Kashmir, as it were, raised the drawbridge to let him in. Very few people were allowed into Kashmir at this period. They were being extremely cagey about admitting foreigners. But I can see that a learned man like that would be an exception. Maybe had Abhinavagupta spoke the right word in the right ear, and so he was, as it were, given a passport for entry. It's merely a hypothesis, but I can't quite resist the temptation to voice it for you. Okay, now I'll stop there.